morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, January 18th, 2021, and today I'm going to share three very short stories from Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, and George Washington that I've shared in separate episodes, maybe a number of times actually, but putting them together to warn about the dangers of usurpation and the precedent that every exercise of power outside of the Constitution creates for the future. Then I've got a bit of a rant, I guess depending on my mood as we go through this, a bit of a rant about how things are done today, which is totally different than their approach. And I'm going to focus primarily on the response to the ACA over the last 10 years. And then since it's MLK Day, and my favorite quote from MLK is the one where he said, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. He's following the advice of St. Augustine, the view that an unjust law is no law at all. So I want to wrap it up with a couple of juicy tidbits from the great old revolutionaries, James Otis Jr. and John Hancock. But first, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, all spelled out. That's where you're going to find all the archives of the show for over 2.5 years. On individual episodes, I include links to the stuff that I'm talking about. So like on today's show, I've got links to articles, I've got links to original source documents, speeches, and stuff like that. So you can read and learn more at your own pace and on your own time. You can find our membership program where you can support us for as little as $2 a month. We make it go a long, long way in support of the Constitution and liberty. And I want to take a moment to point out that we've got a ton of platforms. I know we live stream on the mainstream ones like YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. We're also on Twitch and DLive, but we're on a bunch of other, I guess we call them alternative platforms, and I want to take the time so you know where to go once we're gone from wherever your favorite one is. We want to be as many places as possible, and we're going to use the tools that are available to us to reach as many people as possible for as long as we can, but we have to recognize that we have to be safe and smart about this. That's why I focus so heavily on our video platform, our channel over at Library, LBRY.TV or Odyssey.com. It's from the same people, different version. You've got one that's primarily an app, like I use it as a desktop app for library, and then the web version at Odyssey.com. Please follow us there. We also just started our channel over at tv.gab.com. I did a test uploading an old episode on the right to keep and bear arms there yesterday. It seems to work really solid there, so we'll be hopefully uploading all of our videos there after the live broadcast. We're also on Brighteon and BitTube and BitChute, plus the podcast editions, Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Podbean, and the rest. Again, all that and more over at the show homepage, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we're waiting for everyone to get the notifications to join us on the live stream, I want to say quick hello to everyone in the live chat. Well, a brief one. Funky euphemism, always good to see you up in the Twin Cities. MRGF in Murica. Tim Martin in Casa Grande. Grant Sunberg, good to see you, buddy, in Columbia, Missouri. Tyler B as well. Heather Rossi, haven't seen you on the live stream for a while. Good to see you, Heather. Erwin, Dixie Strong, Lauren Smith. Tim Martin says, go ahead, rant away. Murray over in Michigan on Facebook. Grant likes the idea of us being on Gab. I don't find a ton of content that I actually like over there for my own personal consumption, but I love the idea that they're building their own infrastructure. So I'm fully on board with that. Funky likes Odyssey, and I want to say hello to Jeremy and everyone else. I apologize for anyone who I missed. I will read through the chat a little bit later on if I have a moment to answer some questions later in the episodes. Otherwise, please do leave some comments. I read them all and reply to as many as possible a little bit later in the day. Again, let's start this out. I mentioned that I was going to talk about Thomas Jefferson, John Dickinson, Thomas Jefferson, the primary author, I guess we could say, of the Declaration of Independence. John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, the father of his country, George Washington. Let's start out with Jefferson. This is in 1791, February 15th, exactly 10 months before the Bill of Rights was formally ratified, February 15th, 1791, his opinion against the constitutionality of a national bank. It's important today. I did a whole episode on this opinion a little while ago. I should have had a link to it, but I don't. Anyways, he put it this way: to take a single step, to take a single step beyond the boundaries thus specifically drawn around the powers of Congress is to take a possession of a boundless field of power. He's talking specifically about precedent. As soon as you establish a precedent that the limits, the chains of the Constitution, as Jefferson put it, the foundation, which he referred to as what became the 10th Amendment, that's from that same opinion in February of 1791. He's basically saying, like, soon as you set the precedent that you can go beyond those limits, you might as well give them a boundless field of power, because that's what they've taken. That's what you've allowed at that point. And of course, he was far from alone. But what was the reason for it? What was their reason that they understood this? Because they understood history. They were great students of history. Even the ones who were considered not great students of history for the time, like if you grade on a curve, were far better students of history than most of us alive today. And here's John Dickinson. They recognized that throughout history, this type of thing happened. I've cited John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which earned him the moniker or the name, the penman of the Revolution. This was in response to the hated Townsend Acts of 1767. He wrote a series of letters in response from 1767 through 1768, 12 of them. Here's the end of letter, I think this is letter 9. And he gave a story about Spain. He said Spain was once free. Their Cortes, that's their parliament in essence, resembled our parliaments. No money could be raised on the subject, so the people, without their consent. So this was the notion that if they can take your money without consent, then you have no liberty. You don't have a right to your own property. So he said they were free. So without consent, without support, they could not raise money. Then he goes on. He says, one of their kings, having received a grant from them to maintain a war against the Moors, desired that if the sum which they had given should not be sufficient, he might be allowed for that emergency only to raise more money without assembling the Cortes. So the short version, of course, they set up a system where people could not have their money taken from them without consent, at least through some kind of formal process. Then, of course, there's a war. We know that wars have all through history, as Thomas Paine once put it. He said, wars were not raised to carry, taxes were not raised to carry on wars. Wars were raised to carry on taxes. And he recognized this throughout history as well. But anyway, so the king was involved in this war, and they gave him permission. Maybe that was the problem. And then because it was an emergency and they don't want to lose the war and get conquered, they gave him the emergency power after a long debate. Dickinson even sums that up if you read through this. I will link to it in the show notes. They said, okay, this is an emergency, this one time. If it gets crazy, you can take the money as you decide, Mr. King. He says it was complied with by the votes of a majority. It was violently opposed, he said. This is John Dickinson again. But it was eventually supported. He says this single concession was a precedent for other concessions of the like kind, until at last the Crown obtained a general power of raising money in cases of necessity. So this one precedent, just like the precedent of the income tax that we have today being a temporary wartime measure over 100 years ago, now, well, we know how that played out. Or the Patriot Act was just going to be used for the terrorists, of course, right? All these things that they say they're going to do things for always get expanded through precedent over a long period of time into something much greater. And you're wondering, like, oh, it must have been one dude or another. But no. It's a lot of people who have allowed this thing to happen over a long, long time. And again, he says this single concession, this is the same approach that Thomas Jefferson had. He said to take a single step beyond the boundaries of the Constitution. He's recognizing, just like John Dickinson did, and it's not like Jefferson and Dickinson were always on the same side with their same views, but of course they co-authored together. They co-authored the Declaration of Causes for Taking Up Arms, which was published and approved by the Continental Congress on July 6th, 1775. I believe that was the correct date. Again, the single precedent is the problem, because we know as soon as that precedent happens, they're going to build upon that precedent with another and another and another. It goes on. He says, from that period, the Cortes ceased to be useful and the people ceased to be free. That was the moment. It wasn't at the moment later on when the king could raise money in cases of necessity rather than emergency. It was the necessity of what the king thought the money was for. It was the moment that the precedent was established. And he sums this up like he did all of his letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania with a Latin phrase. I cannot pronounce this one, but it's translated to, well, lightly translated, I'm sure, to oppose a disease at its beginning. And then I'm going to cite one more time, and I've been saying this almost every episode lately, it seems like, but George Washington's farewell address, September 19th, 1796. Again, he's talking about usurpation of power, exercise of power not delegated to the government. He says, let there be no change by usurpation. Like, if you want the government to have more power, there's a process, he says. There's a process in how to do that, how to change the Constitution. He says, let there be no change by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, just like maybe the Cortes, or you think that the Patriot Act was a good thing to deal with the terrorists or something at that time. You may like it right now, but over time, they're going to use it for all kinds of other stuff. The precedent is what destroys liberty. The precedent, the single step beyond the Constitution, as Jefferson put it, is a boundless field of power. And Washington summed it up like this. He says, in the one instance, it may be the instrument of good, but it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So Jefferson, Dickinson, Washington, certainly not always all on the same side, of course, sometimes very much opposite, but that brings me to more modern times. And I said I was going to have a little bit of a rant. I've got some notes here about how this is kind of played out, but I've been watching this for a long time. A lot of people came to us and learned about the 10th Amendment Center due to our opposition to the Affordable Care Act. Of course, we were founded in summer of 2006, and we were opposing things under the Bush administration, Patriot Act, War on Drugs, Real ID Act, for example, the unconstitutional war in Iraq and elsewhere. So we were around, but a lot of people started really noticing us. We got a lot more media attention. Of course, MSNBC, Rachel Maddow did a 14-minute segment on our work because they didn't like the fact that we wanted to nullify the Affordable Care Act, because we recognize, like Thomas Jefferson did, that whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, it's supposed to be nullification as the rightful remedy, not begging the government to give those powers back. So that was signed into law, what, in March of 2010, I think. That's when the former president signed into law. And so our first response was to put together model legislation, which we distributed to state legislators around the country. A number of them introduced. But in general, we were told to wait. So the establishment who had control over whether bills would move forward, a lot of times there was a lot of grassroots pressure in support of this effort to nullify the Affordable Care Act, the ACA, Obamacare. And instead we were told, don't do this yet. I mean, this is kind of like your last approach, right? We're not ready for this. Let's support a bunch of Tea Party candidates and then we'll get it repealed. So all through 2010, we're told, hold the line on this. Okay, great idea, but no one's going to pass this. We got close in South Carolina soon after, but not passed. And so we worked really hard on it, but we had a lot of opposition from what would be friendly quarters because we were told, you gotta wait. So then we waited. And then it didn't happen. No repeal happened. A lot of things were filed, and of course it went nowhere. And then in 2011, we tried the same thing. But again, we were told, well, there's a big lawsuit, and we got to go to the Supreme Court before we do anything like that. That's really radical, Bolden. Don't try that. wait. Just wait for the Supreme Court. So we waited, and we kept pushing, of course, but we ran into a brick wall with many from the right who were saying, you got to go to the Supreme Court first. In fact, a lot of organizations that you'd think would work with us on these types of things, grassroots organizations, some kind of establishment, some not, some Tea Party groups, were organizing protests on the steps of the Supreme Court. I don't know if you remember this, but my jaw dropped. And I get the idea of getting out in the street, but we were encouraging people, if you're going to do a protest, protest at the state capitals, because that's where you're going to have an impact. Standing out, traveling across the country to go to the Supreme Court, to storm the steps of the federal judges and beg them to do the thing that they're supposed to do, was a waste of time, money, and energy. And that's what we warned about right off the bat. And so we were told to wait and wait. You can't nullify yet. You got to wait. 2010, 2011. And then in 2012, of course, we know that didn't play out. NFIB versus Sebelius. We got a little morsel in there reaffirming the anti-commandeering doctrine that states don't have to provide personnel or resources to the federal government, but that was already established in precedent since 1842. So it was nice to hammer it home a little bit more in the court case. But again, the Affordable Care Act still exists. Then, of course, we were told in 2012 the same thing. Oh, we just need a change of personnel in Washington, D.C., and then we'll get rid of it. And of course, that didn't work again. Then 2013, 2014, we had cases like Burwell, for example. More court cases. Again, we're told, wait for the court to go through this. This is a process. There's a legal process to do this. This nullification thing, this is way too radical. So we're told, wait again, 2010 through 2016. And then you know what happened in 2015 and 2016. We were told on day one the process would begin to get it repealed. And then it was actually kind of shifted. Actually, I think the lead dude who was talking about that really focused on repeal and replace. And we put out the message that, look, repeal and replace is not the same thing as eliminate, because whatever they're replacing it with is going to still be unconstitutional. But yet we were told we got to wait because a lot of people misinterpreted it, assuming that it was going to be gone on day one in 2017, or maybe it was going to be 64 days or 100 days. But still, we're waiting to get rid of it. And now we're awaiting on another lawsuit. Yet again, it's all about waiting. It's all about national solutions. And this is totally different than the viewpoint, the approach, the mentality that was taken by people like Jefferson, Dickinson, and Washington, and many, many others. Here, for example, is John Adams. Let me pull him up and see if I can get him on the screen here. There he is. John Adams, back when he was one of the good guys, writing as Novanglis. I think in Latin it was a loose translation that really meant New Englander, and people will tell you if you look at like Latin boards, which I do once in a while to understand some of the language that the founders used. I have never studied it. I am horrible at it. My pronunciation is terrible. So I look at a bunch of these message boards and people will laugh. John Adams wasn't known to be all that great with his Latin, and he'd kind of mesh words together, and basically he signed this off as Novanglis, which in essence meant New Englander. And he was writing in his third paper in February of 1775, he said, "Nip the shoots of arbitrary power in the bud is the only maxim which can ever preserve the liberties of any people." Again, nip the shoots in the bud. Nip it in the bud. That doesn't mean ask them to nip themselves in the bud. Certainly not. He goes further. He says, when the people give way, their deceivers, betrayers, and destroyers press upon them so fast that there is no resisting afterwards. So don't let it go. Don't wait a while for the federal government to limit its own power. That's how we can apply that today. Don't wait for federal politicians to say, oh, all this power, this stuff that we passed, well, we changed our mind. You're right. We shouldn't have done that in the first place. Or when the court establishes a bad precedent and expands more centralization of power, don't go to the court to fix the problem that it fixed itself, that it created itself. Certainly those are avenues, but they should not be ever your primary reliable, it's not, your reliable approach on how to deal with Washington, D.C. Again, John Adams, 1775, when people give way, they press so fast. The destroyers, let's look at these government people as what they are. Deceivers, betrayers, and destroyers. They press upon us so fast, there's no resisting afterwards. He goes on, the nature of the encroachment upon the American Constitution is such as to grow every day more and more encroaching. Like a cancer, it eats faster and faster every hour. And that's exactly how we have something like the Patriot Act and mass warrantless surveillance being used for anything and everything when we're told it's only going to be used for the terrorists. Of course, we shouldn't believe that. Or the IRS, or what happened to the Cortez in Spain, as John Dickinson recapped in letter 9 from the farmer in Pennsylvania. Here's Thomas Jefferson, of course, putting that into practice. What's this resisting? What's this nipping in the bud? Well, Jefferson, in his fair copy of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798 in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts, put it this way. Where powers are assumed, and again, he's talking about powers of the federal government, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. So according to Thomas Jefferson, of course, the founders did not all speak with one voice, but I've done a number of episodes talking about how across that political spectrum of the time, the idea of resisting usurpation was very common. Whether it was Jefferson, it was also Theophilus Parsons, it was who was a leading Federalist up in Massachusetts, James Iredell in North Carolina, who was nominated as one of the first Supreme Court justices by George Washington. So you have Federalist, kind of a mixture, and of course people like Patrick Henry and other leading anti-federalists who are all on board with the idea when government exercises power not delegated to it, there has to be some level of resistance. And in 1798, Jefferson pointed out that it should be nullification. Now, Jefferson didn't think that nullification was a good idea or something you might want to try, or if a bunch of other stuff doesn't work after a few years of having like a violation of your freedom of speech on the books in Washington, then we'll get to nullification. He says, no, as soon as they assume that power, as soon as they do that, because you recognize that a single step beyond the Constitution, that's what he wrote in 1791, just some years earlier, he had this same viewpoint, very consistent. As soon as they take that single step, they're taking a boundless field of power. And the only way to do that is, as John Adams put it, nip it in the bud. And how do you do that? Jefferson told us a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. Again, I have mentioned this a bunch of times recently, just like I do with George Washington's farewell address, but here again from Jefferson's fair copy of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798, he points out that a vote the bums out strategy is only for an abuse of the delegated powers of the Constitution. Again, he put it this way. In case of an abuse of the delegated powers, the members of the general government being chosen by the people, a change by the people would be the constitutional remedy. So if they just do bad administration of the stuff that has been delegated to them, that includes maybe using some of those powers when they should just not. So just because they can regulate commerce among the several states doesn't mean they always have to do it. Just because they're authorized or they have a power delegated to Congress to declare war doesn't mean they should. So when they do things like that, when you think they shouldn't, you vote the bums out. That's the change of the members. Change of the people, that's the constitutional remedy. But, he says, where powers are assumed which have not been delegated, a nullification of the act is the rightful remedy. And yet 10 years later, when we're talking about the Affordable Care Act, we've got plenty of advice from the founders on resisting usurpation, nullifying federal acts that are outside the Constitution. 10 years later, we're still sitting here waiting. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting for a change of the guard, for the Supreme Court to help us and to save us, for a new executive to come in and protect us, ride in on a white horse. But there is no one coming from Washington, D.C. that will protect our liberty from Washington, D.C. Now, whether you think those approaches are a good idea or not, they're all about wait till later. We're going to hear now that the administration has changed. We're probably going to hear from the right that the only way to protect us is to change the Constitution, as if the Constitution itself is at fault, rather than the people not working to enforce it or focusing only on these national solutions. But James Otis Jr. had a different view on this, and he put it this way. Let me pull this up. I've got a couple of other quotes here. Other passages from this quote. This is him writing as Freeborn American, April 27th, 1767. He says, "There is no character so dangerous to liberty as the man of prudence." You may be right, he says. He's giving an example of what people say. This man of prudence says, you may possibly be right, but at this juncture, it's not prudent to insist upon it. Otis says this is the language of artful courtiers and has done more hurt than well can be imagined. Again, it's the idea that what we've been hearing for the Affordable Care Act, just wait, don't nullify now. Go through Tea Party voting and court, and then another round, and then more court, and then another round, and it's always do that later. In other words, you don't have the backbone to stand up for it right now, or maybe you're just too ignorant to do something. Maybe you're scared. Maybe you don't know. Maybe I've done a horrible job getting this message out there. But even when confronted with this information, how the founders approached things, how Jefferson said to deal with things, Madison, Iredell, Henry, Parsons, Samuel Adams, so many others, we're still told, well, that was then, and this is the process now. But James Otis put it this way. He says, when our rights are invaded, it is high time to throw aside prudence. So waiting and waiting and waiting is not the right approach. We need less of this wait for some national process to play out and more nullification. One of my favorite quotes ever is from one of my favorite founders. This is John Hancock in 1765. Just a couple of weeks, this is the end of the year, a couple of weeks before the Stamp Act was supposed to go into effect. So sometime in maybe October that he wrote this to his London agent, Jonathan Bernard. He really captured the spirit of the people of that day, and it's a spirit that we need to actually have as our primary response today. And he put it this way: the people of this country will never suffer themselves to be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. It's so awesome. I summed it up like this, explaining James Madison's advice on how to deal with federal power. That is a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union in an article that I wrote in 2016. Here's the bottom line. You're not supposed to wait 2 or 4 years for some new politician to get in office and give you permission to be free. You're not supposed to wait 2 or 4 or 6 years for some federal court to tell you, okay, you be free now. You're supposed to stand up, resist, refuse to comply, and nullify unconstitutional federal acts as soon as they happen. And that resistance needs to be your first response, not your last. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. Hopefully it riled you up to support some nullification efforts. You can learn about the things that we're doing over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report, so you can get a much more detailed overview of the theory, the history, the strategy, the view of the founders, even the court cases which support the strategy that we use today. 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. The second half, this is a 108-page free download that we do almost annually, that we just published over the summer. And the second half shows how it's being used in practice. I encourage you to check that out. And this is the time when state legislatures are in session. In the early part of the year, this is the time to contact your state legislators, representative and senators, and urge them to take action. You'll find a lot of ideas in that free nullification movement report. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see what you guys have to say. Grant Sundberg says nullify the $15 minimum wage. Yeah, I mean, basically everything that the federal government does is unconstitutional. A lot of the problem that we have is it's a manpower issue. It's people focusing in the wrong area, or sometimes it's a logistic. How do you actually make that happen in practice? I know Grant had asked me about this on Twitter, had mentioned this. I'm fully on board in principle. I just don't know how that would actually work. Of course, talking about it is the first step, really. Rudy says, awesome show. I appreciate that over on Facebook. Good to see you. Alexander Helling as well. Jeffrey says, thank you for educating us on Facebook. And it's not really even me. Literally all I'm doing is, and I've been doing this now for about 15 years. This summer will be 15 years. I've been working on this particular message for about 15 years. So I've just learned what the founders had to say. We didn't get taught this stuff in government school. Anybody can learn the stuff that I've learned, because I don't have a college degree. I'm no lawyer, none of this. I just spent time reading what they've done, how they lived, what they wrote to each other, how they responded to stuff. And I've found patterns, and it's basically, you cross a line in the sand, we're going to do something about that. MRGF says, I understand nullifying federal tyranny. Does it apply to state tyranny too? Certainly, but the strategy is totally different. I did an episode on that last year talking about nullification of state violations of the state constitution. You can't use the same approach because the legal setup, the legal status of how you deal with a state and local governments, the way that they're actually part of the state, is totally opposite of how states created the federal government. So that's a very short version of it. So it's going to take, on a state level, it takes more of a individual resistance approach, a civil disobedience than anything, especially on MLK Day. That's a good thing to mention. So I appreciate you actually bringing that up as well. Taking a look as well. Thank you, Connie says, I'm definitely interested in how to nullify. I've got an episode that I did on this show, and it's probably, I know you're on Facebook, it's harder to find there, but if you go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty, if you like podcasts or video version, just go to that page, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. As you scroll down, I've broken down some of the most popular, we've got, of course, at the top, you're going to find all the platforms, and then you're going to find the latest episodes. But as you scroll through the page, you'll find different categories, and one of them is going to be nullification strategy, nullification essentials, and there's a ton of them. There's probably like 10 episodes of how to do this, and I would look for the one, and it'll be pretty obvious, nullification and introduction, and then of course read our State of the Nullification Movement report, 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. It's a lot of info, it's a lot of sometimes technical stuff, but if you want to know how to do this, you're going to learn that, and you're going to see how it's playing out in practice today. Anyways, I'll look over at the live chat a little bit later on today and reply to as many questions as possible. I get tons of ideas for new episodes. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. Again, I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed this. If you support what we're doing, smash the like button, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're able to on podcast platforms. Leave comments in the archive. All that tells the algorithm to show the program to more people. Look for us on some of those alternative platforms, which we hope become more mainstream over time. And of course, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work, do not feel obligated to do this. But if you have a couple of bucks a month you want to throw our way, please do so over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope your Monday's off to a good start, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.